Today at ShopTap.com we'll be going a timing belt on a 1.8T Audi TT. Okay, so before we get into doing our timing belt on this car, this is a procedure that I don't know is necessarily for everybody. This procedure is something that if you do not do this properly, you can damage your engine. If you time it wrong, you make a mistake, something loosens up after you start your engine after performing this procedure, you could cause major catastrophic damage to your engine. So it's important to note you should not do this. I also would recommend making sure you have a repair manual or something like that that you follow along with while doing this process, because again, this is something that is a vital component of the engine and you can cause damage. With that said, we're replacing the timing belt, the tensioner, and the other components in there, including the water pump. This is something that is a 100,000 mile interval on most of these cars. Most of the time you would want to do this before that. Somewhere in the 80,000 mile range is generally what most people would recommend, because belts do wear and can break before their maintenance interval when you're working on these cars. So do your timing belt, make sure it gets done. It is an expensive procedure, but it's very important. With that said, let's get into our install. Now this is on a 1.8T 225 horsepower engine, so things are going to be a little different on this car than you would see on most transverse 1.8T engines, but things like a GTI or a Jetta or a Beetle or anything along those lines. But it's going to be very much almost the same, minus a few variations as far as some intercooler piping and some things like that. With that said, let's get into our install. Now before we start on our timing belt, because we are replacing our water pump, we're going to drain the coolant. Some people would just allow it to drain out of the water pump, but we're going to drain this first. So take the cap off and we're going to go underneath the car. So this car luckily has a drain valve on the bottom of this lower radiator coupler. So all you're going to do is unlock that by turning it to the left, kind of like a screw, and then you pull it back and it should release. Now we're also going to remove this cover here. This is a splash shield. We have the hardware removed. There's a torque screw in the back that holds it on. And then on this car, there's 10 millimeters that hold it in up top to the frame rail. On most Volkswagen models, they actually use what I call, and most people call, snowflakes, which are just like kind of metal star clips, and you just yank down on it. So if you have those, you will just yank down on this thing, but this thing comes down smooth because it just uses nuts. All right, now this is done draining. We're closing this up so we don't have any more continue to leak out on this side, and then we're gonna go back up top. Okay, so we have to take off this pipe. This is, again, only on these engines because we need to access our timing belt area. So most of the models will not have this. This is the one exception because this car has 2 intercoolers. All right, now we got our pipe off. We're gonna access our timing belt. Now we're gonna remove our power steering reservoir and then the coolant bottle. They don't need to be removed completely, but we do need to loosen this stuff up to get this stuff out of the way. And we're gonna take these Phillips off to hold the coolant bottle in. And this bracket can go out of the way. Most cars aren't gonna have that. And your bottle should be pretty empty because we've drained our coolant out. So we're just gonna take this, disconnect it, and we're gonna take our hose clamp pliers, remove that. Now this is because we already drained the cooling system, this is gonna be a lot easier because we can just take this bottle out completely. If you haven't drained your coolant, you're gonna have a hard time doing that. So this process will be a little bit different. We're just gonna swing this out of the way for now. Again, most of these cars are not gonna have half of this vacuum routing stuff that this car has because this is a unique vehicle. Now we're gonna take these 13s off. This is just a side bracket here by your engine mount. Again, your car is probably gonna look slightly different, but it will have something like this there. And this pipe will now be loose and out of the way. All right, now we're gonna take our wheel off. This is so we'll have access to everything under here because we are gonna have a floor jack under the engine. So we're gonna slide this underneath our engine. We are going to support the engine so that we can take our motor mount out. Okay, so what you're gonna wanna do is get your jack under here, get a piece of wood so that it's supported, then jack this guy up. And really once you see tension on there, you wanna make sure you get that centered. Get tension on there, and then that's gonna be good enough. Now we're gonna crack our 16 millimeter bolts loose that hold this bracket on, the engine mount, to the body of the car. I'm just gonna crack those loose, and then we'll loosen them the rest of the way with the impact. Next, we're going to go right here, and this is where the engine mount actually bolts to the bracket that holds onto the engine itself. So we're just going to crack these loose. These are 18 millimeters. And careful, because when you unbolt these, the engine's going to start to move down on you. So you want to make sure you're well supported as you loosen this down. All right, now we're going to pull our engine mount out. Now on this car, it's going to be a little worse to access this stuff, but just because you can't see a lot. But that we have now accessed everything we need to get to our timing belt. All right, so what I'm doing now is actually removing the power steering bottle. I'm gonna take this line off and move this bottle out of the way. So this is not something that I think is necessary, and I wouldn't even recommend it to do for everybody. We're only doing this so that we can give you guys as much of a visual as possible while we're doing this job. Otherwise, I would say you're probably gonna be best to work around it. That would be my advice. It's going to be up to you as far as what you want to do, because you're going to lose power steering fluid and you really don't need to do this. So with that information in mind, it's probably best to not mess with it. And then we're going to use a plug for the other end of it, and then we're going to throw a rag underneath of it to catch anything we lose. All right, so now we got that on there. We can swing this up over here towards the front of the car just to get it out of the way. Okay, now we're going to pop these fuel lines off. These are your fuel and return lines. All you're gonna do is kind of push in here. There are these quick connects. You push in and you kind of push down, and then you pull up. And it is important to take note of where these are located, because if you put them on the wrong place, the car either won't run or sometimes you'll send fuel into your evap canister if you put them in the wrong place. So it also is important to note that if you break these, the lines that go towards the back of the car, you have to replace the line that goes all the way here back to the fuel tank. So don't break them. All right, we're gonna pop this timing cover off now, and all you do is take those clips, one in the front, one in the back, slide it out of the way, and then we're gonna work that thing up and out of the way here. Okay, so right now we have our serpentine tensioner. We have a 16 millimeter wrench on there. That's just a little tab that's on top of it. You're not gonna be able to see a lot, but you have to loosen it so that you can release the belt off the pulley. So you're gonna push down, and we're actually at a bad angle there. So I'm gonna turn this wrench around because I can't get it extended quite enough to release it. So take one hand, go there, and then the other, go up on the alternator is my advice. And then you can pop your belt off and just make sure you clear all your hoses and stuff as you release that, because it's gonna come back further. You may need to take note of your belt routing. It's something that, if you're not familiar, a lot of people like to take a piece of paper and draw how it routes on the belts to make sure that they don't forget. All right, we have these 13 millimeters that hold a tensioner on. We're gonna take these off. Maybe worth noting that you may consider doing this before loosening the engine mount if you would like, just to make sure that everything is secured, and if you're concerned about dropping the engine while you're doing this. So this car, these 13s go through this bracket, which is a support for that boost pipe. That is not going to be the case on most cars. And now we should be able to release this thing and pull this tensioner out. So we have our 16s now on this engine mount bracket. We're going to loosen. There's one here, one down at the bottom, which you should be able to lower the engine down to get to, and then one at this back corner, which you basically have to do blind. It's underneath this kind of hook part of the bracket, and it goes to the back of the engine block. We are going to just crack this loose, and I'm gonna break this back one loose as well. All right, so we have this bolt done, this bolt is done. We're gonna go underneath and show you that bottom one. Crack that loose. This is our lower engine mount bolt. Now that bracket is loose. Okay, so now we're looking at our lower crank pulley. So now what we're looking at is a timing mark right up here. There's a dimple on this cover. Our bracket's moving around a little bit, but we're looking for the timing mark on this cover. Actually, you can go back. I'll just show you, just so we can show you where it is. So that timing mark needs to line up right where you are, and then we need to line up the cams to have them in time as well. So you need the timing mark on the bottom to look like that, and the top one to be in time as well. All right, so on our camshafts, we have this in time as well. So you need to keep turning over the engine until these both, the upper and the lower, line up at the same time. So this is the timing mark on the engine right here, this notch on the cover, and this is gonna be your timing mark on the pulley right here. So now that we see they line up, we're all set. Now what I'm going to do is mark our belt as well. This is just extra precaution when you're doing this job. Now we're going to take the bolts off that hold the crank pulley on here. They're 6mm Allens. You have to be super careful with these, because if you strip these, you're going to have a really bad time. You're not going to be able to get this pulley off, and then you're going to have to figure out a way to get them off. If you do damage them, there are things called easy outs which you can use. You can drill them out, or you can use an air hammer. Actually, it would be the way that most techs would use to kind of hit it, to chisel it out and break it loose, and then spin it out by hand. You will want to make sure that you get these in there and that everything turns cleanly before you have them in there all the way. It's possible people may have stripped them before you, like this one. Nice, nice. Stuck on there, but it didn't strip. All right, now all of our bolts off. This should just wiggle right off. And just a note, you can see when you're on here, there are these dimples here that go in these other holes, and then the other ones are the screw holes. And then we can take our timing cover off, and that's these 10mm here, and then some on the upper part. All right, now that 10mm is out, we gotta take the upper bolts off. Okay, so we're taking off 10mm. This is here, and then these two down here should allow us to access the bottom. And then there are some on the sides, on this side, and I believe there's some on the back as well that we're not going to be able to show because this bracket's in the way. So we're going to take these off, and this should be able to allow us to remove our covers now. And you shouldn't do this until you have your engine already in time, as we are. Okay, so we have our 10mm off. There's actually only those 3, and then it hooks on over here by the water pump. So what we're going to do is loosen it up there, and then there's a hook part that comes on right here behind the water pump. So you kind of rotate it up and kind of kick it out like that, and get it out of place. Okay, so now we have our timing belt exposed completely on the top and the bottom. One thing you want to do when you're doing this as an extra precaution, just in case anything jumps at a time during this process or whatever, you will want to take timing marks, and you'll paint the timing marks. So what I'm going to do is I have a paint pen here. You can use something that you might have at home that would work. It would be something like whiteout. People also use things like nail polish. So I'm sure your wife, mother, or girlfriend would be super thrilled if you use her nail polish on this. So what you do is put a paint mark. So what I like to do is put 2 marks up top, and then I'll put 1 on the bottom. That way we'll know exactly where we're supposed to be. So, and again, you do this because now we know that the 1 mark goes at the bottom and the 2 go at the top. And you can paint your other belt to match this one to make sure you have everything timed up. Okay, so now we're jacking our engine back up. We tried earlier. Okay, so what you're about to witness is something that requires some delicacy, because we have a pry bar propped in here. It's against the frame rail here. Here's our AC line here. We have to clear this up and over and out. This AC line tends to be very much in the way when you're doing this job. So what you need to do is kind of pry back on it a little bit, because you got to get this to clear the frame rail. Now we may need to jack this engine up a little bit more to get this to clear. So this is the real struggle. Okay, so now we're jacking our engine back up. We tried earlier to remove this without that cover off, and I think that was part of our problem, was that cover was blocking us. It prevented enough movement here from rotating this thing to make it difficult to get off. So taking that cover off gives us more room to work with, and we should be able to get this bracket to clear a little easier now with the way it is currently. Having it.
Damn, Bobby.
All right.
Now just toss it.
That's how you throw it against the wall. Okay, so now we're gonna take the tensioner off. I'm gonna loosen that. It's an 8mm, and that should allow us to remove our belt. And so we're gonna break that loose. I need the longer one. Fucking A.
What are you breaking loose?
The fucking tensioner.
What?
Yeah.
That's only like 35 Newton meters.
Well, that's more than 35 Newton meters. You saw how hard I was pushing with this thing.
I saw that.
So what we're gonna do when we loosen this, you'll see this thing will pop off, and it'll fall off eventually, and this belt should loosen up. That's why you want to make sure you have all your marks painted before you do this and your engine in time. That is a warning. Warning, 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 warning. All right, tensioner off. We dropped our washer, and make sure we get that guy. And we can take this guy out of place here. So we're gonna take off this tensioner. This is a hydraulic tensioner. This ram pushes on a tensioner. The kit we're using replaces this tensioner. If you were to be reusing this, which what you're looking to do is inspect it to make sure it's not leaking oil. And if it is, then you definitely want to replace it. But what you want to do is compress it to push this piston in, and then there's a hole here and a hole in this rod. So you squeeze it in. We'll show you an advice one just as an example so you can know what that process looks like if you were to be doing it on your own. And now we're going to take this out. Okay, so we're showing you as an example what you're going to do with this in a vise. What you want to do is put it in there, and then you have a hole in this rod and a hole right here. And what you're going to do is take something, a lot of times the easiest, most accessible things most people are going to have is like a drill bit that's going to be strong enough to hold this thing. If you try to use like a paper clip, it's probably going to break right away. So first you need to rotate the hole to make sure, see right now it's not lined up. So you'll need to rotate the hole so that it lines up, put it into a vise. You can compress it like this. You want to do it slowly and evenly as you do it. And then once it's bottomed out and the hole lines up, you drop your drill bit in there, you release it, and then it's compressed so that you can reinstall into the car. Again, we're not doing that because we're going to be replacing this and we're not going to be reusing this. All right, now we're going to pull our belt off completely and get this out of the way. Then we're going to remove our water pump. All right, so now we have rotated our floor jack around to the front. This is because we got the pan here that we want to get underneath this side of the engine, because when we release this water pump, even though we already have drained the coolant, there still should be some residual. So you're going to make a mess regardless, but we're going to try to minimize the mess that we make. So we're going to get this under here and remove our water pump. And the water pumps just have 3 bolts holding them in, just 10 millimeters. I'm going to do 2 with this impact, and then the last one we're going to have to do by hand. Yep, you're able to get all 3. So when you get that out, it does take, because it has an O-ring in there, you're going to have to rotate that out. So you can see it's pretty much still in there all the way. You can rotate it just to feel if it's moving. But what you're going to want to do is get a screwdriver in here and pry right there. So we have our pry bar from before. You don't really need to do a lot of prying here, but just a little bit wiggle there. And again, we're going to expect to lose some coolant. So even though we drained it, we obviously have quite a bit of coolant still coming out. So we have this pump out. We are just going to clean up this area just so that we can make sure if we have leaks, we know what's up. So we have some brake clean. We're going to spray all this area down. This car did have an oil leak before, so there's some residual from that. And we're going to clean all that up. Okay, so now we're going to put our water pump in. We are going to take a little bit of this water, just run it around the seal real quick, because it should help get in there a little bit easier and keep the seal from pinching. If you don't do that, or even maybe if you do, and you don't do this right, you could end up pinching that seal or the O-ring and then having your brand new water pump seal leak. So what you're trying to do is basically just rotate this thing in there and apply some pressure. When you get this thing popped in, get it spun in place towards your bolt holes. We have our water pump now installed and it is all snugged up, and we will have the torque specs that will flash on screen for you for torquing down that water pump. All right, so now we have our new belt on the outside, the old belt on the inside, and you want to count the teeth between the timing marks, and that's what's going to tell you how many places to mark this at so you know you're in place. Now, what I like to do is make sure that the marks that I have on this belt right here as the text is facing me as the time belt out. That's just kind of a weird thing, nothing that's not necessary, but it is something I like to do. So I'm going to match this up here with this other timing mark. Now, what I'm going to do is, you can't just assume that this is right, because this, obviously there are different lengths, one being on the inside, one being on the outside. So what I'm going to do is take this out, count the number of teeth between here and here, and then match that same on the other. So let's count that now. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we got 63 teeth between the two marks. I want to count that again just to verify that that is correct. Just a trick that I do, I kind of try to keep my thumb on the one that I'm counting as I do, and then I move down so I don't lose my place, because that's obviously easy to do. 1, 2, 3, 162, 63. Okay, so 63 on that one, counted it twice, count 63 on this one, and then we'll make our mark after that. So, okay, so I just counted out, this is my 63rd, and then I made a slight little mark here, just so that I can count again to double check my count and make sure that I'm correct before I mark it completely. So I'm gonna count again to verify that that is 63 between here and there. So I will mark that at 63, and then we'll count between the two. So there's 63, and then there's 2 between, because we know these are gonna be pretty much identical. So I'm gonna make this mark look like that mark, and we're ready to go on. Okay, so we just wanted to show you this as an example as to why you don't just match them up and then mark them. You can see how far apart these are, because the inside and outside diameters change it quite a bit. So that is a good reason not to do that. All right, so we have our timing marks, and you can see they line up there. And so we're gonna take our belt and get this thing all lined up. So what we're gonna do is route this around the bottom, and then we're gonna pull that tight and then go to our lower timing mark. All right, I'm gonna take our zip tie here, and just so that when we're showing you everything and trying to teach you where we're at, we don't lose this doesn't move on us. So that is secure. So you don't want to need to go crazy tightening it, you just want the thing to not jump at a time. So it's all timed up, and we can get everything else in place. You want to route your belt around your water pump and then down to your crank. Okay, so we need to get our timing belt, our mark onto there. So you can see we got to get about a tooth over to get this in place. To get that in line, what we're going to do, keep in mind, we have the top stuff already locked in place. It's zip tied on, it's not going anywhere. So the reason what you're going to struggle with is getting this thing in place, because there's, your belt has a lot of tension on it. So what we can do is rotate it back a little bit to allow this to line up. And then you can rotate it forward to take the slack out of that belt. So you can get it on there, and then you can just rotate it forward like this, take the slack out, and then you can go back up top to get your tensioner in. Okay, so now we're gonna put this tensioner roller in place. Now the reason why you do that is because if you try to put the tensioner completely in place first and then this, you will not have enough slack to work with. So what I recommend is put this roller in place, get lined up, you can leave it completely loose, get threaded in, and then you can see you kind of have this up and down movement here from that tensioner. Leave it loose completely, get this bolt threaded in. You don't need to thread it in all the way. You can leave yourself some slack to work with, and then we're gonna put that other tensioner in place. All right, now once you have the tensioner roller in place, you will want to double check your timing mark to make sure this is in place. So because we're about to finalize getting this timing belt in there, we are all set there, and we're gonna go back in and get that tensioner, the hydraulic portion, mounted. Okay, so we're gonna put this tensioner in place. This piston part pushes on the bottom of this bracket. So you rotate that up like that. As you see, it tightens the belt, and then you gotta get this seated in place. So all this stuff's gonna get pretty tight once you get this mounted in there. This roller starts to push on the belt, and you have a harder time getting this lower portion seated in. So it does have to sit properly, and you want to make sure you pay attention to your bolt holes to line them up. And then you want to give yourself obviously as much slack as you can to work with, and then get your bolt and get this thing threaded in place. So I'm going to get this back bolt in first, Okay, so what I found actually is the bottom one down here is easier to get in first. And then we have this sitting kind of on top of it. So that way you don't have as much to work with. So once you get that in there, this one should be a little bit easier to line up. And so it may require you to do some pushing, kind of lift the tensioner up and then push forward on it to get it into your bolt hole. So kind of use what I'm using here is my thumb here to push up, and then my thumb to push up on this, and then my pointer to push forward on it to get this thing in a place where it needs to be. Okay, so now we've snugged up our 10 millimeters for the tensioner. I'm going to tighten down the tensioner itself here. We'll give you the torque spec for the 10 millimeters to hold on the hydraulic tensioner, and then the tensioner roller bolt, this 8 millimeter Allen as well. Okay, so once you've torqued that in place, everything is all set. You can double or triple check your timing marks to make sure you're set, and then you can pull your pin of your hydraulic tensioner. And once you do that, what you want to do is I'll just give it a little pull on this to make sure that this is tight. And then you should see your hydraulic tensioner extend. To pull that out, we can cut our zip tie and rotate our engine to make sure everything stays in time. All right, I'm just gonna throw this bracket in place so that we can run this thing around and check our timing. All I wanna do is kind of get this thing mounted in place in a real basic way. And then I'm gonna just thread one bolt in so it doesn't fall down on us. And then we'll spin our engine over. Okay, so we have our cover on. We just have two 10 millimeters threaded in place, one here, one up top. This bracket makes it challenging to get the engine mount bracket in and out, so removing this cover makes it easier. So we don't want to put this thing completely together until we've checked timing, because if you find any surprises, you want to be able to take care of that. So we're going to throw this guy in place here, snug one bolt up so that we can spin this thing over a few times, make sure our timing mark still lines up. So remember that timing mark we talked about right up here? This is what we're checking. So we're gonna take this thing, snug it up all the way, make sure that pulley, it doesn't need to be too tight, just enough that it's not really moving around a lot. So once you get that thing in, we'll snug it down and we'll spin this thing over. So we have our timing marks here, that's marked against here, and then we are going to spin this around. So we have our timing mark down on the cover and down here. And so we should be able to spin our engine over a bunch of times and have everything line up. We're lined up at the bottom, we're lined up right here, across, and we're lined up down there. So we've double checked our timing, we're all good there, and now we can reassemble. All right, so now I'm gonna take off these 6 mils, that cover, and then we're gonna get the engine mount bracket back in place. We can get this engine back hung. Again, we're doing that because that bracket can be challenging to get in and out. So you will want to make sure you have that cover off to give you as much clearance as possible. Okay, so now we're going to drop this in place. I suspect this will go in about as easy as it came out. So we're just going to get that set in place, and then we're going to grab our pry bar to push back on these AC lines. Go. All right, now I'm going to thread these bolts that hold this bracket in place. One thing you want to make sure you do with this is there are different lengths, so you will want to make sure that you take note of where you had them. The longest one is going to be in this front portion, but you will want to make sure you pay attention to where the bolts came from. Now that we dropped our bracket for our engine mount in place, we're going to put our timing cover on and get this timing cover bolted in place with those 10 millimeters. There should be 5 of them, and then you're also going to get the engine mount bracket and then the pulley for the serpentine belt, or for the lower crank pulley, mounted in place as well. All right, we're going to throw our crank pulley on now. We have all those cover bolts on, and then we're going to get one of these threaded in. Once we've snugged these all up, we will flash these torque specs on screen for you so you can torque them down. Now we're threading our 16 here for this engine mount bracket. This one's easy to get to when you have the engine drop down, so after you're done with this pulley, it's good to get this guy threaded in, and we will give you those torque specs as well. All right, so we're gonna throw our bracket on, and first we're just gonna get this single bolt threaded in, and then we'll get the other ones with the upper bracket and all the other stuff mounted in place. All right, so we are going to get this serpentine belt threaded in place, and what I like to do is take it, get it mounted on the lower pulleys first, and then pull up from there. So I'm gonna pull it from underneath just to get it onto the pulleys, and then we'll get back up top here. Okay, so what I found to be the easiest way to get this thing is to make a loop and squeeze the loop in between the AC compressor and the alternator and then this tensioner roller, and it will kind of captivate that loop, and then you can route it around the bottom section, and then you can take that, grab onto your tensioner, start to tension it, and then grab onto this loop, keep the tension going, and then you can pull it back on top of your alternator. And we're not on exactly everywhere. Back here, and I think we are now all set. Now we're going to install our engine mount, and to do so, just going to drop that in place, and then you should be able to see everything line up. So, and BFI includes new hardware with their stuff, and the larger ones go on the engine mount bracket side. Remember, you don't want to tighten any of these down until you've got them all in place. And so what you can do is, if you have a hard time with something lining up exactly right, because the engine shifted a little bit, you just grab a pry bar, stick it in there, and kind of wiggle it a little bit like that. And it can help you thread that thing in there. As you can see, if you let loose on that, the ratchet will start to get a lot of pressure, but if you give a little tension on there, it loosens it up awfully quite a bit. And then we'll include the torque specs for both the engine mount to the body, and then as well as the engine mount to the bracket here. Okay, now we're gonna reinstall all the stuff we disassembled, including the vacuum lines, hoses, and all that stuff. And then we're going to reinstall our coolant bottle. Okay, so now we have our time belt is all done. Because we drained our coolant, we do want to make sure we fill it back up. So we have our factory VW coolant here, mix 50-50, and we're gonna fill up our bottle and then burp our cooling system to get all the air out. You do need to make sure that whenever you do get coolant out of your system, that you get the air out, because otherwise you will end up with an overheating issue. Okay, so whenever you have a vehicle that you've just done a time belt on, burping the cooling system consists of allowing the car to run at idle with the coolant system open until the fans run and all the thermostat opens and everything else. After that, you should go on a test drive, verify it's not overheating, all that stuff, just to make sure you're good. If you get air pockets stuck in your cooling system and you don't burp them out, your car will overheat. So you will want to make sure you do this, and that's a very simple process of going through this to making sure there's nothing in the system. If you have a hard time getting it to burp, what you can do is jack up the side of the car that the coolant bottle is on and allow it to run, or even sit overnight sometimes. Just turn the car off, let it sit overnight with it high, and then it'll hopefully push the air out to the highest point. That's why you want to jack up the car, to get the coolant bottle as high as possible. Thank you so much for watching our video on changing a timing belt on a 1.8T Audi TT. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more like it.